And we'll start Chapter 9 of Sword in the Stone. "Well," said the wart when he woke up in his own bed next morning, "what a horrible grand crew!" Kay sat up in bed and began scolding like a squirrel. "Where were you all last night?" he cried. "I believe you climbed out. I shall tell my father and get you tanned. You know you aren't allowed out after curfew. What have you been doing? I looked for you everywhere. I know you climbed out." The boys had a way of sliding down a rainwater pipe into the moat, which they could swim on secret occasions when it was necessary to be out at night, to wait for a badger, for instance, or to catch tench, which could only be taken just before dawn. "Oh, shut up," said the wart. "I'm sleepy." Kay said, wake up, you beast! Where have you been?" "I shan't tell you." He was sure that Kay would not believe the story, but only call him a liar and get angrier than ever. "If you don't tell me, I shall kill you." "You won't, then." "I will." The wart turned over on his other side. "Beast," said Kay. He took a fold of Wart's arm between the nails of his first finger and thumb, and pinched for all he was worth. Wart kicked like a salmon which had been suddenly hooked, and hit Kay wildly in the eye. In a trice they were out of bed, pale and indignant, and looking rather like skinned rabbits, for in those days nobody wore clothes in bed, and whirling their arms like windmills in the effort to do each other a mischief. Kay was older and bigger than the wart, so that he was bound to win in the end, but he was more nervous and imaginative. He could imagine the effects of each blow that was aimed at him, and this weakened his defense. Wart was only an infuriated hurricane. "Leave me alone!" shouted the wart again and again. "Leave me alone, can't you?" And all the while he did not leave Kay alone, but with head down and swinging arms made it impossible for Kay to do as he was bid. They punched entirely at each other's faces, as boys will. Kay had a longer reach and heavier fists. He straightened his arm out, more in self-defense than in anything else, and the wart smacked his own eye upon the end of it. The sky became a noisy and shocking black, streaked outward with a blaze of meteors. The wart began to sob and pant. He managed to get in a blow upon his opponent's nose, and this began to bleed. Kay lowered his defenses, turned his back upon the wart, and said in a cold, snuffling, reproachful voice, "Now it's bleeding." The battle was over. Kay lay upon his back on the stone floor, bubbling blood out of his nose, and the wart, with a black eye, fetched the enormous key out of the door and put down Kay's back. Neither of them spoke. Presently Kay turned over on his face and began to sob. He said, "Merlin does everything for you, but he never does anything for me." At this the wart felt he had been a beast. He dressed himself in silence and hurried off to find Merlin. On the way he was caught by the nurse. "Oh, you little helot!" exclaimed she, shaking him by the arm. "You've been a battling again with that there Master Kay. Look at your poor eye, I do declare. It's enough to baffle the College of Sturgeons." "It's all right," said the wart. "No, it isn't, my poppet," cried his nurse, getting crosser and showing signs of slapping him. "Come now, how did you do it before I have you whipped?" "I knocked it on the bedpost," said the wart sullenly. The old nurse immediately folded him to her broad bosom, patted him on the back, and said, there, my Dalzabel. It's the same story Sir Ector told me when I caught him with a blue eye gone 40 year. Nothing like a good family for sticking to a good lie. There, my innocent, you come along with me to the kitchen, and we'll slap a nice bit of steak across him in no time. But you haven't ought to fight with people bigger than yourself." "It's all right," said the wart again, disgusted by all the fuss. But fate was bent on punishing him, and the old lady was inexorable. It took him half an hour to escape, and then only at the price of carrying with him a juicy piece of raw beef which he was supposed to hold over his eye. "Nothing like a mealy rump for drawing out the humours," his nurse had said, and the cook had answered, "Us hasn't seen a sweeter bit of raw since Easter. No, nor a bloodier." "I will keep the foul thing for Balin," thought Wart. Resuming his search for his tutor, he found him without trouble in the tower room, which he had chosen when he arrived. All the philosophers prefer to live in towers, as may be seen by visiting the room which Erasmus chose in his college at Cambridge. But Merlin's tower was even more beautiful than his. It was the highest room in the castle, directly below the lookout of the great tower, and from its windows you could gaze across the open field with its rights of warren, across the park and the chase, until your eye finally wandered out over the distant blue tree tops of the forest sauvage. The sea of leafy timber rolled away and away in knobs like the surface of porridge, until it was finally lost in remote mountains which nobody had ever visited, and the cloud-capped towers and gorgeous palaces of heaven. Merlin's comments upon the black eye were of a philosophical nature. "The discoloration," he said, "is caused by hemorrhage of the tissues, ecchymosis, and passes from dark purple through green to yellow before it disappears." There seemed to be no sensible reply to this. "I suppose you had it," continued Merlin, "fighting with Kay?" "Yes, how did you know?" "Ah, well, there it is." "I came to speak to you about Kay." "Speak, demand, I'll answer." "Well, Kay thinks it's unfair that you're always turning me into things and not him. I haven't told him about it, but I think he guesses. I think it's unfair, too." "It is unfair." "So, will you turn us both next time that we are turned?" Merlin had finished his breakfast and was puffing at the meerschaum pipe, which made his pupil believe that he breathed fire. Now he took a very deep puff, looked at the wart, opened his mouth and to speak, changed his mind, blew out the smoke, and drew in another lungful. "Sometimes," he said, "life does seem to be unfair. Do you know the story of Elijah and the Rabbi Jackanin?" "No," said the wart. He sat down resignedly upon the most comfortable part of the floor, perceiving that he was in for something like the parable of the looking-glass. "This rabbi," said Merlin, "went on a journey with the prophet Elijah. They walked all day, and at nightfall they came to the humble cottage of a poor man, whose only treasure was a cow. The poor man ran out of his cottage, and his wife ran too, to welcome the strangers for the night, and to offer them all the simple hospitality which they were able to give in strange circumstances. Elijah and the rabbi were entertained with plenty of cow's milk, sustained by homemade bread and butter, and they were put off to sleep in the best bed while their kindly host lay down before the kitchen fire. But in the morning the poor man's cow was dead." "Go on." "They walked all the next day and came that evening to the house of a very wealthy merchant, whose hospitality they craved. The merchant was cold and proud and rich, and all that he would do for the prophet and his companion was to lodge them in a cowshed and feed them on bread and water. In the morning, however, Elijah thanked him very much and sent a mason to repair one of his walls, which happened to be falling down, as a return for his kindness. The Rabbi Jackanin, unable to keep silent any longer, begged the holy man to explain the meaning of his dealings with human beings. "In regard to the poor man who received us so hospitably," replied the prophet, "it was decreed that his wife was to die that night. But in reward for his kindness, God took the cow instead of the wife. I repaired the wall of the rich miser because a chest of gold was concealed near the place. And if the miser had repaired the wall himself, he would have discovered the treasure. Say not there of the Lord, what dost thou? But say in thy heart, must not the Lord of all earth do right?" "It's a nice sort of story," said the wart, because it seemed to be over. "I am sorry," said Merlin, "that you should be the only one to get my extra tuition. But then, you see, I was only sent for that." "I don't see that it would do any harm for Kay to come too." "Nor do I. But the Rabbi Jackanin didn't see why the miser should have had his wall repaired." "I understand that," said the wart doubtfully, "but I still think it's a shame that the cow died. Couldn't I have Kay come with me just once?" Merlin said gently, "Perhaps what is good for you might be bad for him. Besides, remember that he has never asked to be turned into anything." "He wants to be turned, for all that. I like Kay, you know, and I think people don't understand him. He has to be proud because he is frightened." "You still don't follow what I mean. Suppose he had gone as a Merlin last night and failed in the ordeal and lost his nerve." "How do you know about the ordeal?" "Ah, well, there it is again." "Very well," said the wart obstinately, "but suppose he failed in the ordeal he hadn't failed in the ordeal and hadn't lost his nerve. I don't see why you should have to suppose that he would have. Oh, flout the boy! Cried Merlin passionately. You don't seem to see anything this morning. What is it you want me to do? Turn me and Kay into snakes or something. Merlin took off his spectacles, dashed them on the floor, and jumped upon them with both feet. Castor and Pollux, blow me to Bermuda! He exclaimed, and immediately vanished with a frightful roar. The wart was still staring at his tutor's chair in some perplexity. A few minutes later, when Merlin reappeared, he had lost his hat, and his hair and beard were all tangled up as if by a hurricane. He sat down again, straightening his gown with trembling fingers. "Why did you do that?" asked the wart. "I didn't do it on purpose." "Do you mean to say that Castor and Pollux did blow you to Bermuda?" "Let this be a lesson to you," replied Merlin, "not to answer, or not to swear. I think we had better change the subject." We were talking about Kay." "Yes, and what I was going to say before my visit to the still vexed Birmouth was this. I can't change Kay into things. The power was not deputed to me when I was sent. Why this was so, neither you nor I am able to say, but such remains the fact. I have tried to hint at some of the reasons for the fact, but you won't take them, so you must just accept the fact in its naked reality. Now please stop talking until I have got my breath back and my hat." The wart sat quietly while Merlin closed his eyes and began to mutter to himself. Presently a curious black cylindrical hat appeared on his head. Merlin examined it with a look of disgust and said bitterly, "They call this service," and handed it back to the air. He closed his eyes and proceeded with growing indignation in rapid succession: a top hat, a Sherlock Holmes hat, a sailor hat, and a girl's sailor hat. Finally, he stood up in a passion and exclaimed, "Come here!" The wart and Archimedes looked at each other, wondering which was meant. Archimedes had been sitting all the while on the window-sill and looking at the view, for of course he never left his master, but Merlin did not pay them any attention. "Now!" said Merlin, furiously, apparently to nobody. Do you think you are being funny? Very well, then. Why do you do it?" "That's no excuse. Naturally, I meant the one I was wearing." "But wearing now, of course, you fool. I don't want a hat I was wearing in 1890. Have you no sense of time at all?" Merlin took off his sailor hat and held it in the air for inspection. "This is an anachronism," he said severely. "That's what it is, a beastly anachronism." Archimedes seemed to be accustomed to these scenes, for he now said in a reasonable voice, "Why don't you ask for the hat by name, master? Say, 'I want my magician's hat,' not 'I want the hat I was wearing.' Perhaps the poor chap finds it as difficult to live backwards in time as you do." "I want my magician's hat," said Merlin sulkily. Instantly a long-pointed cap was standing on his head. The tension in the air relaxed. Wart sat down again on the floor, and Archimedes resumed his toilet, pulling his pinions and tail feathers through his beak to smooth the barbs together. Each barb had hundreds of little hooks and barbulas on it, by means of which the barbs of the feather were held together. He was stroking them into place. And we will pause there.